is a franchise right for me? And if so, what types of franchises should I be looking at? What's going to be best suited to really help me get where I want to go?
Welcome to the Freedom Point Real Estate Podcast, where we talk about creating more time freedom through passive real estate investing. Passive investing in real estate challenges conventional investment wisdom. We are passionate about learning and sharing resources with others who are ready to transform their investing mindset. Quick disclaimer as always, I am not a CPA, I am not an attorney or a financial advisor. This is not financial advice, not telling you or anyone else what to do. The views and opinions expressed in these podcasts are provided for education and informational purposes only and are not necessarily the views of my employer, ADP. I'm glad you're here. Now let's dig in. Thank you, everybody, for jumping back into another episode of the Freedom Point Podcast. I have an excellent guest with me today, Wes Barefoot. Wes leverages his experience, all right, as a franchisee, all right? So most people that listen to this podcast aren't maybe familiar with the franchising space. So you're going to learn quite a bit today from Wes. So he's both an experienced franchise owner as well as he works with numerous franchisors to help others evaluate franchise ownership and determine if that is a path that might make sense for them. Wes, thank you for joining the show today.
Absolutely. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's just dive right in. I'm sure you've got a lot more things going on than what I just unpacked there. So maybe you can kind of fill in some of the gaps for the listening audience.
Yeah, for sure. So, like you hit on, my kind of area of focus or expertise is franchising and franchise ownership. So, am currently a franchisee with two different brands that my wife and I own. We live in the coastal North Carolina area, so we operate those businesses in coastal North and South Carolina. And we got into that, kind of fell backwards into franchising. It wasn't something that we aspired to, as we were coming out of college. But a few years out of college, I started working for a company here in Wilmington, North Carolina. And that company had recently started franchising their business. So I find myself working for a franchisor and ultimately ended up selling franchises, which exposed me to this whole world of franchising and a sector of franchising that I find a lot of people are not as familiar with. I would refer to it as, number one, non-food franchising, but service-based businesses in franchising. So that opened doors for my wife and I to become franchise owners and kind of start, building businesses for ourselves. And then that led to me starting a consulting business, Path to Freedom, where I work with individuals that do have an interest in exploring franchise ownership, like you alluded to, Jeremy, and helping them really understand the ins and outs, the pros and the cons. And I have a portfolio of brands, about 250 or so different franchise companies that I have relationships with. So as I work with an individual through my process, we're able to establish some criteria that's most important for them, in a franchise business. Ultimately, that allows me to recommend specific franchises that are aligned with their goals and what they're looking to accomplish. And then I coach them or advise them through the due diligence and the research to, go out and get all the information that they need to really understand the business and determine if it's something that makes sense for them. So we can unpack as much of that as you'd like to, but got a few things going on, most of it kind of franchise focused and, young family, 3 kids on top of all of that. So, not a whole lot of time for me to get into any trouble. It all keeps me pretty busy.
Thank you for sharing that. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So you've got 3 young kids. I know all about that. And you and your wife are active owners with 2 franchise brands, and you manage a franchise consulting business on the side or full time. How on earth do you manage all of that at the same time? Does your wife take half the responsibilities? You take half? I mean, how is it that you have any margin in your life, Wes?
Yeah, it's a lot of dividing and conquering, right? Working together, my wife and I in a partnership. And so it didn't all happen at once either. We got into our first franchise business shortly after our first daughter was born. She's 6 now. I was still working full time when we started that first franchise business. So that very first franchise, it's a company called Shelf Genie. If anyone wants to check it out, but the goal there was that was going to be my wife's focus. She had been in pharmaceutical sales, went out on maternity leave, just really couldn't get comfortable with the idea of going back to work full time in that capacity and putting our daughter in daycare full time. So, she wanted to work though, she wanted to produce, but in certain types of franchise businesses, your role as an owner is going to likely be a little more flexible than, if you're working 40, 50 hours a week as a W-2 employee. So that was the catalyst for, us getting to where we are today. As that business grew, started producing some income, consistently, that put me in a position to leave the last W-2 job that I had and start the consulting business. And in doing franchise sales for the different brands that I worked for, I'd worked with other franchise consultants, gotten some exposure to how that world worked, and knew it was something I wanted to get into. A big factor of that was, again, just more flexibility of schedule, more control of my time. And so then it was about 2.5 years ago that we decided, hey, let's look at maybe adding another franchise business, something that is complementary in nature to the one that we already had. And with that one, we've had a full-time manager running that business for us since we started it. So still requires time, yes, but we've got someone in place that's really running the day-to-day of the business. He kind of reports up to us. That puts me in a position to spend the majority of my working time in my consulting business, which is where I really want to be spending my time. My wife still focuses on the first franchise business, but that's 5 years in the making now. So she's got a great team in place and a lot of flexibility. So between the two of us, we're able to balance it all. But it really, I think, kind of highlights a lot of what you're doing, helping people create passive income, because we certainly don't have the bandwidth to go start another business with everything that's going on, even with a manager, in place. There's just not any more time for it. So that's how we have it structured. It's not perfect. Some days are easier than others, but it's been a fun ride, and we've certainly learned a lot along the way.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And you brought up some really good points there where it's really down, it's really about the people, it's about the teams, it's about the system that you have in place. So, major investments in the business sometimes involve bringing in talent, right?
Yeah,
To kind of take
totally.
care of some of those roles and responsibilities that maybe you and your wife were traditionally handling. So it sounds to me like you have some experience working at the franchisor level. You've got some experience certainly on the franchisee side, because you currently own a couple of brands and might potentially look to add a third maybe in the future. But that in and of itself, that background, that experience now puts you in a very unique position, in that on the consulting side of the house, you're not just talking the talk, but you're actually also walking that walk, right? So
Yeah.
talk to us a little bit more about, that. And second to that is, who should really consider franchise ownership?
Yeah, I think that the experience I have does put me in a position to really add, value to the people that I consult with. And, if I've learned one thing over the years when it comes to, who is a franchise right for, and what type of franchise is right for someone, there's not a one size fits all approach to this. It's got to be a very individualized thing. So the franchises my wife and I own are service-based franchises, right? We go out into our communities, we go to our customers to provide a product and a service. Whereas a lot of franchises are, more of the traditional brick and mortar storefront model. And even just within those kind of two categories of franchises, there's a lot of different types of businesses across a lot of different industries. And so my process is very much focused on really getting to know the individual that I'm working with. And a lot of it is understanding what their goals and vision are for the future, where they are today, and how is owning the right type of business going to help them accomplish these goals that they have. And that allows me to really, get to a point where I can make some intelligent recommendations for them in terms of specific franchises that could be a fit. There's got to be a methodical process followed if you want to get that piece of it right. And I see people get that wrong far too often, right? Where they decide to get into a business because they personally, enjoy the product or the service, or they think their area needs more of this product or service, therefore they are going to be the one that brings it to the area. And all of that's fine, but you've got to first really stop and understand, okay, what does my life need to look like to own this business, be successful, and get the type of results that I would expect? Because, one business could require 60 hours a week from you as an owner managing hourly employees, whereas another business could require 10 to 15 hours a week managing just a handful of employees, so a lot of different looks out there in terms of the business model. So we spend a lot of time there. That's all things that should really be thought through pretty thoroughly before deciding, hey, this is the type of business that I want to get into. In terms of who is a franchise right for, all types of people. All right. But let me preface anything I'll say next by first saying a franchise is not going to be right for everyone. Business ownership's not going to be right for everyone. And I want to be very clear in this. Owning a franchise, investing in a franchise is not a passive investment. All right. There are structures in which, the franchise owner can put in less than full time, but there's always going to be a time commitment, and there's always going to be, activities that you as the owner have to spend time on, especially if you want to get the results from the business. So with that being said, I mean, I've worked with everything from, very high net worth individuals that are more investor, mindset, and they are looking for, good cash flowing business opportunities, also something that they could build and potentially sell for a multiple down the road, to stay at home moms that are ready to get back into the workforce in some capacity, but just like my wife wanted, more control over their time and didn't love the idea of going back to, some sort of a W-2 job, and everything in between. People in career transition. I mean, the list goes on, but again, there should be a real methodical process, that's kind of followed to determine, is a franchise right for me, period? And if so, what types of franchises should I be looking at? What's going to be best suited to really help me get where I want to go?
So the people that you talk to, help me understand this. Are they individuals that are maybe they've been in corporate America for 10 or 20 years, or maybe they're looking to make a transition, or maybe it's a husband wife combo, and maybe one of them is looking to unplug from the W-2, the other one wants to get into small business ownership. So I understand that people are coming kind of from all different walks
Yeah.
of life, but what are some of the major triggers as to why somebody decides at this point in their life they want to get into business ownership, and why is franchising right versus them just deciding to start up their own brand?
Yeah. Great questions. And so kind of all of the above in terms of the scenarios that you outlined. Um, all of those very common. Husband and wife teams where one's going to play more of an active role than the other. Maybe one keeps a job. Work with a lot of people that are in some sort of a career transition, right? They've been, laid off one too many times, and the thought of, going back into the job market is just, makes them sick on their stomach. So, the drivers are going to be a little bit different for each person. Why a franchise can make a lot of sense. And I'll preface that by saying there's people out there that I believe would not be happy in a franchise, and they should go start their own business. For someone that's very, very entrepreneurial minded and just is going to not really enjoy operating within sort of any sort of a structure, then a franchise probably isn't right, because there are, kind of guardrails that you have to operate within in any franchise system. Um, I think one easy way to think about it is that a good franchise business is just going to give you the ability to run faster.
Mhm.
My wife and I have two franchise businesses that do well over seven figures each, and we've gotten to that point in about 5 years. And so I have no doubt that if we had an idea to start a business from scratch and set our minds to it, we would have been successful. But I also feel pretty confident in saying we wouldn't be as far along in 5 years as we are now with multiple seven-figure businesses. So I think a good franchise can give you the ability to run much faster. There's a lot of value in the training and support that you get from the franchisor. There's a lot of value in having a network of other franchise owners that are out there operating the same business that you are, especially when you're new, right? Because you've got all these other more experienced operators out there that you can lean on and learn from. So, one way to think about it is part of the value that you're getting, when you invest the money up front to become a franchisee. In a way, you're paying to avoid mistakes that the franchisor and other franchisees have already made. And then there's the whole host of other ways that good franchises are adding value to their franchisees. That can really look kind of different depending on the type of business that you're in. The franchises my wife and I own, a lot of the value is simply in the buying power that we have, right? Because the franchisor is able to leverage the size, of the entire franchise system where we're all buying, the same types of products and materials. So that drives our costs down, right? And we actually are in a position to come out net better even after the fees that we pay, to the franchisor because of the savings that we have on our costs of goods and materials. But that's going to look different depending on the type of business that you're in. And a lot of franchises, the values primarily in the brand name, right? Think about McDonald's, right? So that piece can look very different, but there does need to be a clear value exchange. And just like anything in this world, not all franchises are created equally. And there are franchises that simply don't add enough value to their franchisees to justify what it costs to be a franchisee. So that's something that people really need to evaluate.
Yeah, it's a really good point that you brought that up. You brought up the word value several times, and I can certainly see there's a tremendous value when making a decision as an individual or as a couple or as perhaps maybe a group to invest into a franchise on the value side, because you're immediately gaining value in the brand. You gain value in the playbook, right? That the
Yeah.
franchise gives you to set you up for success. They have skin in the game just like you have skin in the game. They want you to be just as successful as you want to be,
Yeah.
successful. And then obviously just having access to a supporting cast at the operations level of the franchise. And you mentioned the network side of it. I would imagine that having access to a network of other successful franchise owners that have been there, done that, where you can kind of learn from maybe some
Yeah.
of their mistakes and some of those things that or areas that they found success can bring tremendous value to that investment.
So valuable. It's incredibly valuable. I would argue, probably the most valuable aspect of it in the long run. In the early stages, a lot of the values coming from the franchisor, just having that playbook. They are, if they're doing it right, they're going to help you get your business up and running faster. They're going to help you avoid some potholes. But long term, once you're kind of established and you don't rely on the franchisor as much for some of that initial training and support, it's the network that can really just continue to add value to you. So yeah, there's a whole host of reasons why the franchise can make sense. But again, it's not for everyone, and not all franchises are created equally. Like I mentioned, so there's a lot to look into. There's a lot of variables, and it's not something that should be taken lightly for someone that's considering it.
Where do most of your new prospective franchise owners um, what type of capital investments are they typically making? Maybe high, low range. And then, second question along that same lines is, are there areas that they can access that capital that exist outside of coming to the table with just pure liquid cash?
Yeah. Yeah. All really good questions and commonly asked questions. So the first part of that, the investment range or the capital requirements are kind of all over the board for franchises. You've got lower cost franchises that, your all in capital requirements could be as low as 100 or $150,000. Right. And then obviously, there's franchises. I mean, a lot of hotel chains are franchises, right? I mean, you could have seven-figure plus capital requirements and everything in between. But most people are leveraging some sort of a funding strategy for the majority of the capital. SBA loans are very, very common. So kind of rule of thumb there, you would need to put in about 20% of the total capital requirements. If you were leveraging an SBA loan, the loan's going to cover the remainder of that. So on a $200,000 all in initial investment, someone could get in for as low as, $40,000 of their own capital in some cases. On top of that, there's programs out there where people can actually tap into retirement funds that they have, leverage those funds for the purpose of starting a business, and they can avoid the tax penalties that would typically come, with accessing retirement funds early. There's some stipulations with that. So, something that needs to really be understood, but there is a program, they call it ROBS, ROBS, and it stands for Rollover for Business Startups. And, that's a very commonly used funding mechanism. So, I mean, I've worked with some very high net worth individuals that could have easily self-funded, the entire investment for a franchise. And I'm yet to see anyone come completely out of pocket for it. Even the really high net worth people out there are using someone else's money as often as they can for their investments, whether it be real estate or a business.
Yeah, that's great. It's good to know that there's other options for maybe those individuals out there that maybe don't have a high net worth, but they maybe have some money locked up into a retirement vehicle
Yeah,
that they know they're not going to be able to access for 20, 30, or 40 years,
yeah,
that
yeah.
they could use some of that capital to invest into a franchised owned business and really use that investment to grow, grow their income. So that's great.
Yeah, it can be a great option. And one thing I'll kind of add to that, because this is, I would say, a common misconception that I run into. A lot of people think that, naturally the higher the capital requirements for a franchise, the more upside or the more ROI potential there is. And that's not always the case. In a lot of instances, some of your lower cost franchise businesses are going to be just as scalable and I would argue have even more long-term ROI potential, higher potential for margins. So don't necessarily assume that, if it is one of these kind of lower cost franchises that it can't, be built into a substantial business that can generate some serious income.
If I was going to be a franchise owner, there's two industries that I would never go into. Not
I know one of
recommending.
them.
One of them is food.
Yeah,
The
you and me
other
both.
one, the other one is retail. Okay.
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
I have high respect for people that like food and like retail, but those are two areas that I could never see myself in as an individual. Okay. That said, is it fair to say there is really a brand out there for just about any type of small business ownership?
I think that's a fair statement. Again, keeping in mind that not everybody is going to be cut out for business ownership, right? But I've never really worked with someone that was genuinely motivated to get into business for themselves and not been able to help them find a franchise that made sense for them. And again, there's going to be an investment that's required, right? So there are people that are not yet going to be financially qualified to get into a franchise, but assuming you meet kind of the minimum financial requirements, yeah, I would feel very confident in saying there's going to be a franchise out there that could make sense for them. And a lot of really interesting ones too that are just not the types of businesses that people, would typically think of when they think of franchising. I mean, I had a lady on my podcast, she has a mobile dance class franchise, right? They go around and just teach dance classes to preschool kids. There's a franchise out there that cleans up like crime scenes, like murder scenes, and they all the CSI type stuff. They come in and clean that up. There's a franchise for that. I mean, so there's a lot of options and a lot that are surprising to people, but can be really great opportunities.
That's great. So if you're listening to this podcast and you want to clean up crime scenes, give Wes a call. We'll
Yeah.
provide his contact information in the show notes.
Yeah, I might question a little bit if you come to me wanting that type of business, that might raise a few red flags in my mind, but it's out there if that piques your interest.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, I have a couple more questions for you before we wrap up. One of them is, what would you say is the greatest challenge for a brand new franchisee in that first year as they're looking to launch into franchise ownership?
That's a great question. I think sometimes it's getting out of their own way. As long as I've been in franchising, it still blows my mind to this day how many people will invest in a franchise. We've already talked about, where so much of the value is in the beginning is in having that playbook and that training and that support. They invest in a franchise and they think they know better, right? And they want to try to fight the system or fight a part of the system. And I've never seen that work out very well. So, drop the ego, remember why you invested in the franchise in the first place, get out of your own way a little bit. So I would say it's that. And then I think, this kind of dovetails right into that. But, you know, the vast majority of franchise businesses out there are designed to scale, right? And we talked about, the importance of having a team, building a team. That makes a lot of sense as you and I sit here and talk about it today. Very different thing to actually do it. It's not an easy thing, especially if in the very beginning you as the owner kind of have your hands on everything and you're wearing all these different hats. It can be very hard to let go of some of these things and start to delegate. Yet that's when you're going to bottleneck. That's when you're going to, get to a point where you're not getting out of the business what you wanted to, because number one, it's not scaling, but number two, at some point you're probably working harder and you're going to, have a higher likelihood of burning out if you don't take those steps to really start building a team and kind of removing yourself a little bit from the day to day. So I've seen that play out more times than I would like, where an owner just can't let go and they burn themselves out over the course of a couple of years.
What's maybe one or two things that your most successful franchise owners have from a mindset perspective that really has enabled them to become in the top 10%, maybe of store owner operators, or maybe those franchisees that have gone from 0 miles an hour to 100 miles an hour, and they're really leveling up, scaling up their business quite rapidly?
Yeah, I love this question. The first one is they don't make excuses and they understand that as a business owner, the buck stops with them, right? Very big difference from, buying a franchise with the mindset that, hey, there's a system and a framework and support here, but I still have to take all of that, leverage it and execute it to get the results. Whereas some people unfortunately come into a franchise with the mindset of, oh, I just paid all this money, so a profitable business should just materialize in front of me. That's not how it works. So, I have a mentor that, was the president of one of the brands that I worked for earlier in my career. He's owned 5 or 6 different brands as a franchisee over the years. He's been wildly successful in some of them, far less successful in others. And he told me something that's always stuck with me. He said, the franchisor cannot keep you from being successful. They can only help you be more successful. So I
Mhm.
think, that mindset of just, hey, yeah, it's the franchisor's job to help me, but I'm going to be successful no matter what. is important, and something that I see, commonly across top producers. And I think kind of going with that collaboration, right? The most successful franchisees surround themselves by other successful franchisees. They don't waste time talking to the franchisees that are going to be negative and wanting to point fingers in every direction but themselves if things aren't going well. They surround themselves with like-minded people that are all pushing in the same direction, and they level each other up.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I've seen that in my own life, right? Surrounding myself with
Yeah.
other, A players, that are have a vested interest in wanting to level up their game, but wanting to level up those that are quite frankly around them. And we all have an opportunity to become a better version of ourselves, right? Every day. It's not something that you ever reach this point where you've arrived, right?
Yeah.
It's a daily thing. So
It's a grind. Yeah. It's a lifetime of just trying to grow and continue to level up.
yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you 4 rapid fire questions. Okay. The
Okay.
idea here is just to answer them as quickly as you can, kind of a thing, and then we'll wrap up. All right.
As long as there's
So,
no arithmetic, I'm good.
all good. I'm going to keep this all very personal.
All right.
If Wes could go back to his 18-year-old self, okay, what would be one piece of advice that you would give her that you learned?
Uh, Great question. You don't have to have it all figured out.
Yeah.
I can remember even older than that, putting so much pressure on myself that I had to have it all figured out and know what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And here I am at 36 doing something that never even crossed my mind at 18 or even 22 or 23 years old. So you don't have to have it all figured out. Go try a lot of different things, figure out what your interests are, start developing some skills that are translatable to many different things, and it'll start to unfold.
Yeah, I give that advice to my teenage children right now, that you don't have to have it all figured out. Yes, it's important to have goals, but you also need
Yeah.
to be flexible with those goals. And
Yep.
you also need to learn to make mistakes, quite frankly.
Yes.
And I know it's odd
Yes.
to say to learn to make mistakes, but it's really in those times that we try new things where we learn what works and what doesn't work, and how quickly you can recover from making those mistakes. Really helps them to become better grounded and better individuals, and allows them to have a platform to which there's a significant growth. So thank you.
Yeah. I try to teach my kids that, failure is not a bad thing. Giving up is a bad thing, but, trying something and failing just means you're learning, you're getting smarter.
That's right. What's one favorite book or podcast other than the 2 that we host
Yeah.
that you like and that you'd like to recommend?
Yeah. Man, so many good podcasts. So I'm a huge Tim Ferriss fan. So I love his podcast. He's got very interesting guests on, and talk about someone that's always continuing to learn and trying to level up. So highly recommend the Tim Ferriss podcast. I'll try not to give one of his books, since I just gave him as the the favorite podcast, but I think kind of in line with what we're talking about. The E Myth Revisited is an absolute must read for any aspiring entrepreneur, any entrepreneur out there. I try to read it at least once a year. So in line with everything we've kind of talked about today, I would say that's definitely been one of the most impactful books that I've read.
Great podcast recommendation and a great book recommendation as well. So I regularly listen to Tim Ferriss and have read the E-Myth book. So
Yeah. Yeah.
great. What you have a lot of buckets that you've checked off in your 36 years. Are there any buckets left that you have yet to check off your bucket list?
It's a good question. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we're at a point now where the focus is kind of shifted back to simplifying. We've been running really hard for a while, and we've got young kids, and so I want to, and I don't know if this is a great answer to your question, but I really want to make sure we don't let all of that pass us by, because we're working so hard and we're running so fast. So, I think for me, and I'm not just answering this because we're on your podcast. I think the next bucket to really check off is figuring out how to build wealth without it requiring massive amounts of our time, right? So leveraging some of the resources that we've accumulated and that we have coming in because of our businesses, and getting really, really smart when it comes to putting our money to work for us to build wealth so that we can, really have the freedom to spend our time how we want to. So I think we're in the, midway of that, right? We got out of, corporate where we had to report to someone, and someone else kind of had control of our schedule. But, as a business owner, you have employees, you have customers, you still have things that are kind of, commanding your schedule to some extent. So that's got to be the next phase for us. So I don't know if that's too broad of an answer, but that's what I'm really focusing on right now.
No, I think it's great. I mean, the word calibration comes to mind, right?
Yeah, yeah,
You're
yeah,
running hard, grinding it out day after day after day. And everybody gets to a point in their life, okay, whether it's in their mid 30s, mid 40s, or mid 50s, where they realize it's going to be really hard for me to continue to want to have a desire and a willpower to run the race as fast as I've been running it, right?
yeah.
But everybody still has expenses, and they have
Mhm.
a lifestyle that maybe they want. And so they're continually having to try to find ways to allow that cash flow to continue, but not have to actively pursue it, right?
Yeah,
So to get to a point in their life where their money is able to work harder than they are. Does that make
yeah,
sense? Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, that's 100%, kind of where we're at and what we're working towards at this point. I don't want to fall prey to, working so hard for, the last 20 years of my life, or whatever, that comes out to. There's so much, that we've been blessed with in our life right now. Again, kids are young and stuff. Like, I want to make sure we soak up as much of that as we can, and not look back and regret one day that, we were so busy focusing on building businesses and doing all of these other things that, we didn't really get to enjoy that time. So, that's where the focus is right now. And that's again why I love the type of information and stuff that you're putting out, helping people put their money to work for them, and generate more of that passive income.
Wes, how can people connect with you to learn more about what you're up to?
Yeah, would love to talk to anyone that, has any interest whatsoever in learning more about franchising. Most of the people that I speak to initially, they don't come to me saying, "Wes, I know I want to buy a franchise. I just need to kind of know which one." It's very, very, kind of speculative at that point when we first start talking. It's usually one of multiple avenues that someone's evaluating. So I've got time for anyone that just genuinely has some questions and wants to learn a little bit more about this whole franchise thing. So you can check out my website. It's Path to Freedom. So it's path, the number two, FRDM.com. I'll make sure you have a link to it because it's kind of clunky sounding. Check out the podcast. It's the Path to Freedom podcast. Jeremy's, been a guest on my show as well. Pretty active on LinkedIn, Wes Barefoot. You can find me there, but those are the best places. Pathtofreedom.com, Path to Freedom podcast, and come say hello on LinkedIn.
Wes, this has been wonderful. You've provided a tremendous amount of value to my listening audience. I know there's a lot of people that are going to hear this podcast and hopefully be interested, perhaps at some point in their lifelong journey, to consider the possibility of franchise ownership. And so I really appreciate you bringing a lot of value to my audience today.
It's my pleasure. I appreciate you having me, and thanks for creating this platform.
And listening audience, thanks again for joining another episode of the Freedom Point Real Estate Podcast. Look forward to having you on the next episode.
Thank you for hanging out with us today and for listening to the Freedom Point podcast, powered by Starting Point Capital. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on this show should be considered financial advice. Before making any financial decision, please consult with a professional. This show is copyrighted by the Freedom Point podcast. Written permissions must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting. If you're interested in connecting, you can find contact information at startingpointcapital.com.